everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us today. We're really excited to have this amazing conversation. My name is Addison Tobias, and I am the programs manager with MuseumHue. I'll just start off by doing a brief verbal description and introducing my fellow panelists. But I have light brown skin, dark curly hair, and I'm wearing a black top. I will now introduce Jeremy Dennis, who is the executive president and lead artist of Maz House and BIPOC Art Studio, located in Southampton, New York. If you could give us a description.
Oh, sure. So good to see everyone. My pronouns are he, him. I'm wearing a black hat, shorts, flower shirt, and I am a brown person with short hair.
My name is Cjala Surratt. My people are here. I use the pronoun she, her. I am a black woman, turban-wearing black woman with a full black skirt, a striped shirt, and I wear black glasses.
And hello, I'll wrap us up. My name is Ayesha Williams. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am a medium-complected black woman, brown skin complected, pulled back hair, long ponytail, part down the middle. And I am wearing a peach-colored sweater and a yellow and black dress.
Thank you so much. We can do next. So I will start off by doing a brief introduction of what MuseumHue is, why we're here to talk to you today in this panel. Then I will ask some questions to our amazing panelists, and then we will open it up to a brief Q&A. So for those unfamiliar with MuseumHue, we are a member-driven organization based out of Brooklyn, New York, and is dedicated to empowering Black, Indigenous, Latine, Asian, and all people of color through research, advocacy, community engagement, education, and all types of programming. So today we're going to hear from 3 of MuseumHue's advisory committee members for HueArts New York State and New York City Initiative project, which really serves to provide all people, but specifically policymakers, municipal agencies, peer organizations, arts and culture enthusiasts, and the general public with specific data around arts, culture, and historical entities founded and led by Black, Indigenous, and all people of color. If you scan the QR code or go to the bit.ly behind me, you can find the direct link to the HueArts New York City and New York State initiatives. There's a brown paper report, a map, and directory for each. They're 2 separate projects, but both under the same model. So it's a real treat to have 3 of our advisory committee members here who really worked on both projects. Ayesha worked on HueArts New York City, and was an advisory committee member, and then Cjala and Jeremy were advisory committee members for HueArts New York State. So today we will hear from our 3 amazing panelists who are all also leaders of their respective organizations and who are also all situated in different regions across New York State. And we are going to discuss how to go about sustaining a viable future for BIPOC arts entities in New York. So now I want to kick off this conversation by hearing from each of our panelists about what the mission of each of your organizations are, just to give some context. And then if you have a set of core values or principles for your organizations, how do they impact your work, programming, resources, advocacy work, exhibitions, et cetera. So I'll start off with Jeremy.
Oh, sure. So again, I'm representing Maz House and BIPOC Art Studio. It's located on the Shinnecock Indian Reservation in Southampton, New York. Oh, thank you. So always good to get acknowledgement for Shinnecock. So our mission is really to bring in support primarily for BIPOC artists, Black, Indigenous, people of color. And we do that by having weekly workshops that we compensate artists for. We have a year-round residency for BIPOC artists. This is something that we do 2 weeks at a time and provide different ways of supporting through that process. We also do 2-month at a time exhibits for visual artists as well. So we're always trying to say yes to whatever things that artists are dreaming of. How can we support? One special thing about Maz House is it is on an Indian reservation, which is a whole different realm of imagining. So everything is shared, from the land, the air, the water. So how can that be a different way of envisioning how we have a sense of belonging and a sense of art making? And so some of our principles just include things like inclusion, accessibility, how can we use the resources that we have, even though we're a modest entity, we're sort of brand new, and still support artists in ways that established institutions have been lacking, and how can we be an example in that way?
Yes, so we are situated, and it was interesting, I was looking at the program again, and it talked about ecosystems. So we're situated in upstate New York in Syracuse, about 4 hours away from here. And so we came together around, our mantra and mission is art as advocacy, intervention, and interruption. The way that we do that in supporting Black and brown artists is through professional development. We look at equity and allocation of funding, representation on boards, curators, all the different mechanisms behind the scenes so that we can have a legacy impact. We do that through programming, much like you were talking about, exhibitions. We also have theater productions, and most importantly, or not most importantly, but one of the key things as well is policy and speaking and to our representatives about proper representation and making sure that we're in those spaces to make sure that we get what we need.
And lots of alignments between our organizations, and so nice to be connected with folks who are upstate also. That is upstate technically, right? Not okay. I always have to be careful. Hudson is not upstate, yes. But again, Ayesha Williams, our organization, the Laundromat Project, is an 18-year organization. Our mission is simply to advance artists as neighbors and change agents in their own communities. We do that primarily through an artist development program called Create Change. It is a residency program and a fellowship program where we work with artists whose primary affinity is community building, community connection, community engagement. We provide them resources, mentorship, and support to be able to go into their communities and bring those resources, those skills, those talents in to spark conversation, to engage neighbors with one another, to drive direct change in communities where they are deeply embedded to, rooted in, and connected to. Unlike what our name might imply, we don't work out of laundromats. We simply understand the laundromat as a metaphor of a space where folks can come together naturally and convene with one another. So in a laundromat, you would be standing next to your neighbors while you are doing your, going through the spin cycle or the dry cycle. You are sparking conversation, you are connecting with one another, and you are creating coalitions and connections with one another to, again, drive change in community. We are now primarily based in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn. That's where we were founded as an organization. We have done work citywide and supported over 200 artists through the entirety of the organization's history, and are looking to have more deeper investment in both our community of Bed-Stuy geographically and then also our communities of affinity, so our artist communities and those communities that they are connected to.
Thank you each for painting a picture of what each of your amazing organizations do. So just to give some context for the HueArts NYC and NYS initiatives, a comprehensive map, directory, and brown paper report was created for each. The New York City report was in collaboration with Hester Street and the Laundromat Project, and then New York State was with Hester Street specifically, but we mapped over 400 organizations through data collection, mapping out what New York City and New York State look like. So we came up with recommendations for each specific report. And this data really helps to quantify things we already are aware of, but we have the numbers now to really advocate, but also educate. So this is living, breathing research, and we continue to collect resources and data, but we hope we can kind of change the landscape in thinking of New York City and New York State in terms of what BIPOC-led and founded organizations are out there, how can we connect with one another, support one another, and advocate for one another. So for my next question for our panelists, through the HueArts NYC and NYS mapping projects, there were surveys, interviews, community conversations, public forums. Through all these, a picture emerged of hundreds of POC-led organizations in all corners of New York City and New York State that are very diverse, active, vibrant, and multifaceted in their mission and programs. Can each of you please discuss the importance and impact that location and community have on the work that your individual organizations do?
Well, I can't reiterate enough that we're on a Indian reservation, and being a art space, this is so important because traditionally this is just part of our lifestyle. Everything that we wear, everything that we make, the way we see the world is through the arts. And yet today in the 21st century, accessibility to art spaces is so misconstrued, it's unavailable in a lot of cases. Just the resources, the way to feel like you belong in art spaces, the way that your art is appreciated or valued is all skewed. And so being on the territory, being walking distance, being biking distance from everyone who's my cousin, which is amazing, being able to just invite them down the road. It's kind of like going to your grandmother's home, which literally this is in this case. And the idea that we're building this sense of belonging for ourselves, and then we can go out into the world and continue that. But just to give a little bit of context, I know that the Hamptons has a reputation, but where I live in Southampton, just to give you a sense, we as Shinnecock people represent 0.7% of the population, whereas it's a demographic that's 83+% white. Its median age is 55, and so there are young people, there are people of color, but just on the surface, it just feels like you're not supposed to be there for many different reasons. We've been rendered invisible, especially as Indigenous people, for the use of land, real estate, current economics. And so all these different things, I see the arts, in my personal experience, as a route for healing, a route for granting ourselves that existence and that acknowledgement that we deserve. And so I think those are the main points that I always think of, thinking about place and where we are and how we're trying to amplify ourselves.
It's interesting. A lot of what you said just resonated with me quite a bit. So in thinking about Syracuse, New York, I think it's important to situate yourself within our community and understand that there's only 4 galleries. There's only 2 equity theaters. And of those spaces, most of those are tethered to academia. They're tethered to PWIs. So part of why we came to be, and there were 2 energies happening. There was one particular group where we were saying there isn't proper representation, there isn't access. We're also hearing from Black and brown people that when they are in those spaces, that they are places of trauma. And then there's another energy that was happening in the theater community as well. And then we converged and became the Black Artists Collective. And you talk about safety and placemaking. One of the proudest thing that I'd say that the Black Artists Collective has done is that 2 years ago, for Juneteenth, we wanted to come together and watch The Wiz. That's important in this conversation. We wanted to watch The Wiz in a public park that we pay for, our taxes pay for. And ultimately, they would not allow us to proceed in doing that unless we had police. Now, this is why we are in the conversation regarding the trauma and the problematic relationships between Black community and police. So in terms of placemaking and making sure that we have impact, not intention, but impact, legacy impact, we ultimately, long story short, a year later, were able to successfully win that lawsuit against the Syracuse Police Department and the Syracuse City. Now, when I say intervention and interruption and advocacy, what that also meant is that we were really about that we have to have a long-time legacy impact. And that meant that I said, how do we codify this so when the next mayor or the next police chief comes, that they don't erase all this work that's been done and erase the opportunity to have safe space and people can do work and have joy and create and make. So for the next 5 years, the city and the police department have to report out to our lawyer every single permit, regardless of the organization, that happens so that we can keep an eye on and make sure there's no more predatory permitting practices happening in Syracuse, New York.
Talk about accountability. I know we'll touch on that.
Accountability.
It's everything. For LP Places Everything too, we are a hyper-local organization. And also, I'm just thinking back and reflecting on the ideation of HueArts NYC itself, and particularly the time and the moment when that did happen, which is the height of COVID lockdowns, and even going through the process of understanding and assessing how many of us POC-centered, Black-run, founded, centered organizations existed within the city itself was a process because the network wasn't woven tightly together. We know of one another, but just to have like a very concentrated report or share out of how many of our organizations actually do exist, 412, I think at the time when it lasted. I don't know how I remember that number, 412, such an odd number to remember. But the biggest takeaway from that is something that we know intrinsically, but the fact that our organizations being hyperlocal is so important to community itself as a hub, as a place of coming together, as convening of gathering, of sharing and connecting with one another, as being critical to the fabric of a community and of a network of people. And so for us, we are hyperlocal. We are based in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, which is still a predominantly Black community. It has shifted and changed dramatically since the time when we actually moved to Bed-Stuy. We've always been located in Bed-Stuy. We were founded in Bed-Stuy, done work citywide for about 16 years, and then permanently established a location, a storefront there in Bed-Stuy. And through that time, the dynamics of the racial makeup of the community have shifted drastically. But for us, what it means to hold space, to keep space, to make space is very important. A lot of people ask us, what does it mean to be a POC-centered, Black-rooted organization in a community that will soon no longer look like you? And for us, that means everything, because it means that we exist, and we have existed, and we will continue to exist no matter how the neighborhood shifts and changes. And that's so important and critical to just our existence as people and our ability to thrive.
Thank you each.
Can I say one other thing that I thought was really important about this study is the data. I mean, I know that you guys very much are immersed in an election as we are in Syracuse, New York. And often we are going to our elected officials, and there is a tension. I will say in Syracuse, New York, that we have higher lead levels than Flint, Michigan. We have housing disparity. We have all the things that I've heard discussed here in this conference as well. So the difficulty is that the evaluation of the art and the arts is always, there's a tension between that and our children and the schools and the infrastructure. And so it's really being to have that data that we could take back and say that the cultural makers and those who are doing the development in all these other spaces is really, really, really important, and has been integral for us being able to leverage and be able to be in these rooms, be able to move the conversation and have proper representation.
Thank you for that from each of you. I mean, that really ties into kind of my next point. I wanted to ask you all a main issue that came out of both reports, because there are differences between New York City and the whole state, but there are a lot of through lines. Main ones were visibility, recognizing value, placemaking, and breaking silos for POC-led entities throughout New York State. And we see this in New York City as well, with each region being really siloed. A lot of people have the notion of Long Island or the Hamptons being, you know, a vacation spot, or, you know, I can't go there. But there's these rich Indigenous African-American communities there. There's also this throughout through the Capital Region, through Central New York, all across Western New York, upstate. But we're all very siloed in our own, even in the boroughs too. So we have all these, you know, rich arts and culture that's tied to the communities. How can we begin to change this way of thinking through your organizations? Is there any specific ways you're going about amplifying the work your organizations are doing, these under-recognized stories that are there that we just need to amplify and get out to the world? I know, Cjala, you mentioned the data, but can you each discuss kind of like specific ways you're using the data or going about programming to get the word out there for folks?
Yeah, that's a great question. I always think about amplifying the voice of Shinnecock, Ma's House, or individual artists. And so one thing I always try to encourage our visiting artists is that they engage with Shinnecock, its history, its current issues, the people who are living but are unrecognized and unappreciated. And so even though we're a very small community, artists come in, they are educated, they amplify those voices. And I think that's one way of many ways that we're trying to experiment with, just trying to battle erasure. And what Ayesha mentioned before, just the idea that we've been here for 10,000 years, and yet if you go to the Hamptons, you may or may not see a Shinnecock person, and how do you still serve and have a sense of community? And so I always try to think about just the fact that we do have a sense of belonging beyond the reservation. We should take up space. We should feel like these are our ancestral lands that we still continue and should continue to steward. And so I think that this is something that is just the bubbling up. It's just the growing point. It's just sprouting out of the ground as a project that we're trying to do at Ma's House. And all these different ways that people are engaging. That's another major factor, the collaboration with Ma's House and other local BIPOC-led institutions is just so foundational, just because in my experience, and I'm seeing it in other organizations as well, sometimes it's the executive director and that's the whole staff. And how can we just come together and fill in those different gaps and share resources and just lift each other up in that way? So I'm always trying to see the benefit and all the practicality in how we operate.
The Black Artists Collective, I think that where we have arrived at is we have stopped speaking to and asking those institutions that have caused us trauma to give to us. And we're building our own. So we're now a 501c3. We are raising money. We have our own scholarships. We're building our own spaces. We understand, again, because I gave you the numbers as to the number of institutions that there are, but we're also doing things like, again, speaking to one of the things that's in the report is there's accountability. One of the major points that I think is really critical is that there were a lot of solidarity statements. I worked in PR. I had to write some of those doggone things. But the realities is that even though there's a DEI imperative to get the funding, there's no one actually making sure the boardroom has changed. There's no one making sure that the curatorial team has changed, that the directors has changed. So I think that having a metric that actually says to get this funding, there should be long-term legacy impact, that it's clear that you have had those impacts in community, that it's not a one-off, that it's not a program in which you come in and then you disappear. So I think that we move with intentionality, and so therefore asking that there's metrics that they too do the same. So again, not that we are not engaging these institutions, but we are now really putting our energy, our social capital, all of our thought into building for our own community, because we are, as you said, we have been there. We know what it looks like. We know that when you put on a theater production, you're putting on a production. We are doing wraparound programming because there isn't any transportation, that when they arrive, they are hungry. So when we're asking for funding, we know that there's much more that we're having to do to put our arms around community and to have them be able to express themselves through the arts.
Echoing all of that. And then also adding for us, I didn't answer the first question that you had asked about our values and principles as our North Stars, but one of our values is writing our own histories. So as an organization, we see ourselves as knowledge makers, knowledge builders, and knowledge sharers. So for us, the oral history, story circles, documentation, sharing all of that is very important and critical to both expressing where our values are centered and what our measures of success may be or may not be, which may be counter to what, I guess, quote unquote, mainstream metrics might be. But for us, it's very important and critical to invest resources in the ability to tell our own stories, to tell our own histories, to own our own knowledge. And people will always try to tell your story for you, but what does it mean for you to be able to tell your own story is something that we're constantly thinking about. And that trickles down even into our advocating for funds. A lot of times people will look at, your comms department as strictly just like sharing out about a program. Well, actually, our comms department is very much about how are we actually telling narratives, how are we collecting oral histories, how are we archiving that information, how are we then building archives to share that information out with other folks, and where are the resources to support that happening.
Thank you all for sharing. I am curious to know on that, what is the biggest challenge that you each face in your organization? I mean, I know a lot of the HueArts NYC and NYS recommendations and findings spoke to specifics, but if you could each discuss something maybe you're dealing with now that you would like to share with us, that'd be great.
Oh, sure. I'm just so grateful to have been working on the project, so I don't like to talk about challenges and shortcomings, but one thing that is unfortunate is being in the Hamptons, you're next to the top 1%ers, so trying to build capacity is almost impossible from a space where you don't have value in your home, you can't get that inherited value from properties and things like that. So I mentioned earlier that we're accessible, but that's not really true because I inherited a home. It had these kind of makeshift construction elements, and we're trying to build different things like ramps and decks to make every space accessible. And just because of where we live, it just seems like you have to have a certain amount of wealth to make that possible. So we're trying to make that an accomplishment. We're also trying to build more space for artists to support more artists at the same time. So all these different things depend on wealth, they depend on building, depend on connections, And so all these different things are sort of hard to communicate because we were also mentioning the idea of invisibility, the idea of erasure. Our neighbors don't really understand the history of Indigenous people in the area, the fact that they're prospering, the fact that they're profiteering off of stolen lands, and I don't think they absorb the idea that there's some sort of wealth that needs to be transferred, an acknowledgement of that wealth and where it came from. And so I always try to think about how can we change a narrative so that we are both inclusive to those people, but also kind of giving them that harsh reality and education, just so we can all move forward.
We're the same person. All right. Only because I think about that a lot of our major arts institutions and our justice corridor was raised during the 1965 during urban renewal. And so, yeah, speaking to these institutions about corrective, restorative, reparative processes in which not just offering space and making sure there's proper representation, but there's also a monetary component to it, is very difficult. And I think that, what was the second part of the question? So I was going along with Dennis. Jeremy.
Just any challenges that you're facing right now.
Oh, so that goes along with the challenge. So the challenge then is, how do you get those institutions to recognize that? But the other issue too is that we're eds and meds. So what that means is essentially we're mostly educational institutions and medical institutions, and there's been centralization of poverty. So that means for every single one, all that tax money is rolling out into the suburbs, and it's not centralized. So the communities that we're in service to don't necessarily have the means to help build. So it's trying to be in conversation with those who have the means about why what we're doing is important and why it's in service to a community that they don't live in, and they don't necessarily see value in. So this goes to the conversation of this interruption that we do is, again, talking about value and valuation and who is doing that, and trying to navigate those spaces in which we are amplifying our voices, but also having to make sure that they too understand that this is a collective history as well that they need to be pouring into for it to be a dynamic city center.
I will go with, I say challenges or growth opportunities. I'll do both. A challenge is the recognition that smaller, mid-sized organizations like ours are critical and essential to the cultural fabric of society, and we are deserving of support and resources that often are given to larger institutions and entities who are not working directly on the ground with folks making change. And so that, I would say, is a challenge to constantly advocate for that recognition of our value. And then I think a growth area is around a need to fight for the cultural preservation of spaces. In Bed-Stuy, it is a neighborhood that is deeply rich with cultural assets, which, because of the effects of gentrification, of displacement, of rapid traumatic change, are slowly going away. And what does it mean for us as an organization to step up and help to support their sustainability, their preservation, and not just us as an organization, but how the city might show up, how corporations might show up. I don't know if we necessarily want corporations up in there, but still, folks with means and access are there and actually acknowledge the importance of ensuring that these cultural assets still exist is, I would say, a challenge, not a growth area. It's a challenge.
And speaking to that, that's another thing that's in the report, is that it needs to be a participatory process. So showing up with us at the table and letting the communities to center the communities that are most disproportionately affected, centering their voices and their concerns and their needs, I think is the way that we would like them to show up instead of just telling us.
Absolutely. And so what you each share is so important to discuss these issues because we emphasize a lot in the report. A lot of the findings are showing the challenges, and the recommendations are showing, okay, how can we kind of work through some of these challenges or work towards a goal, but we also emphasize the way in which these organizations are thriving. There are so many POC-led organizations that are really thriving, that don't have the necessary funding necessarily, but are doing such amazing work and need more funding. But I am interested in how you each navigate the legacy of your organizations, cultivating those who come after. How are you going about sustaining your organizations and thinking about what keeps it going, and any advice you might have for other smaller organizations who are looking to delve into, sustainability of their org and longevity.
Do you want to start? Oh, okay. Well, this is a very brief panel, but one thing I may or may not have mentioned, that Ma's house is a inherited home. It's my grandmother's home, built in the 60s, and so it was a vacant space we refurbished. And to my surprise, after we got to the state of turning it into a residency and an art space, other people started reaching out and saying they also had a family home that was sitting there. They didn't want it to go to waste. They didn't want it to crumble like ours was. And so I just love the idea of, as a legacy, like, how do you pass on the experience of building that space and allowing other spaces to also thrive? So going against competition and thinking more about abundance. So that's one thing that just overall, maybe nationwide or globally, I'd love to see more spaces, just because we've had about 24 artists of color come through. Sometimes it feels like that breaking point of finally I'm getting recognition, someone's finally valuing my work, but sometimes it's hard to find other spaces that have that same mission, that same experience, finding people who can empathize and share those life stories. And so I'd love to see a lot more spaces pop up, and the HueArts map just be completely full of different people of color-led spaces. So that's one thing. And since Ma's house is a place that I also live, it's a little bit of a weird structure because it's a nonprofit, it's an art space, a residency, and my home. So I always try to think of it in terms of it's always going to exist in some form or another. And just thinking positively and just saying yes to all opportunities is our process so far.
Because I know you've been around. I'm looking for wisdom.
Yeah. As much wisdom as possible, learning by doing. One of the things, actually, I know that came up in the original HueArts NYC report is around, for those of us who do have staff, an investment in staffing at organizations, particularly staffing folks of color, and the importance of nurturing professionals of color within this ecosystem is being so critical and important, and something that LP has, again, another principle or value that we hold is how we nurture leadership as being one of the main drivers of how we understand the growth of our organization. We are 18 years. I am the second executive director of the organization. I just stepped into this role in January, although I had been with the organization for 7 years prior to. My predecessor was there for 10 years, and the founder of the organization, Risa Wilson, was never full-time staff at the organization. She founded it with the intention of handing it off to someone else. And so for me, that also speaks to, when you think about legacy, I think we all have seen ourselves as stewards of the organization, and the organization that is the Laundromat Project is a living, breathing thing. It is a being, it is an ecosystem that we are all feeding into so that it can serve and be an asset to the community in whatever ways the community might need it to be at any moment and point in time. And I think that speaks to just the legacy and the value and what the organization does bring and offer. It's not connected to a person in any way. It's not a cult of personality at all. It very much is, how do we shape this thing so that it can be the greatest asset it possibly can be to a artist community, a geographic community, whatever it might be at any point in time.
You're still a relatively new organization, so we have our 501c3, and we're looking at strategic planning, so we're fortifying to make sure that there is a legacy impact going forward. And I think one of the great gifts of the mapping was that, A, it stopped people from gaslighting us and saying we couldn't find any black dancer, we couldn't find, so we could now point to this map and say there's across the region, there are a plethora of opportunities in which you can be invested. But I also think that it gave us an opportunity to have elder organizations that we can look to as well, so that we make sure that there is something that is strong and has all those kind of components that are needed. And I think that what you brought up is very key, is that often we are looking to those who are the visual and performing artists, but we are also thinking very much about professional development for those who are the administrators and the development officers as well.
Thank you. And this leads me into, I think we'll have time for our last question, but accountability, which I know we kind of already touched on, which is a major, kind of $1 million question, but this work is not stagnant. It is happening. It is going to continue to happen. And MuseumHue and all of these organizations are working to ensure that this does get done, that there is accountability, but how can we ensure that there are mechanisms in place to hold folks accountable either internally at the organizations, but also externally and beyond? I know that's maybe a difficult question to answer, but are there any thoughts around those accountability mechanisms?
I would say going back to the writing on history, writing it down, sharing out what you are doing, what you are asking for constantly as I think a way to both show what you will hold yourself accountable to and offer yourself up to be checked by the community and people as well, and not to be afraid of that. For us, we have a set of POC-centered principles, so they are guiding principles that for us affirm ourselves as an organization centering people of color, and we have committed publicly to releasing a report about how we are holding ourselves accountable to those principles every 2 years. It's our accountability report. If you go to our website, you'll see it posted there. And it is our offering to community about how we are showing up and continuing to center folks of color in all that we do. And it's an opportunity and it's an explicit ask that we ask of community to share back the ways that we are not showing up and the ways that we can show up. So I would say organizationally for us, that's an accountability checkpoint to make sure we're still always constantly moving at the rhythm of community, at the pace of community, and responsive to and reflective of community, not just saying this is what we think we want to offer, this is what we think you need. Actually, how can we be responsive to what is actually needed?
I'll just say briefly, I really knew nothing about the 501c3 structure when we started Moss House, and I had that idyllic vision that it's literally you're just getting enough funds to break even to make the mission possible. So I always think about the values of transparency, letting people know your mission, what you're up to, what people are giving, and what that monetary value is turning into. And so I know that's not always the case with nonprofits, the idea that things can be misspent, it could just be hoarded, spaces that don't really serve the public are still registered. Some of them, in our case and in our neighborhood, to my surprise, are really just for the wealthy elite. And we've seen this in the news. And just going back to the utopic vision of what nonprofits can be. And I think that's something that everyday people I'm learning can help with. Everything is available online. You can go through 990s, I'm learning, and just see who's giving major donations, where are those funds going, and maybe questioning the existence of other entities that may or may not be doing the right thing.
I agree. I think for us, we're always thinking about metrics of success and interrogating what those mean internally and externally, and making sure that within the ecosystem that we are, because there is a great pressure to do this, to make sure we're not centering whiteness, to make sure that we are centering community and the community which we serve, that they are a reflection of our success, and that we have a willingness to shift. I think that I've been in a lot of places where I would say has founder syndrome, and that there's an unwillingness to do that interrogation and to then shift. Because unfortunately there is a metrics, there's a foundation, there's funding that has dictated you must continue down this road, though you know the impact is harmful. So to really be fortified in that we will move according to what the community needs.
Also, just really quickly talking about the legacy and also the accountability and just something that you said, I just want to lift up, and I'm sure we all know that we, the nonprofit model is set up to be a space that perpetuates a sense of scarcity, and that should not be the case. I give all credit to the founder of the Laundromat Project, who in the founding of the organization intentionally, in her fundraising model, if you want to call it that, always fundraised to a surplus. to ensure that we could exist. We should not be living in this model where if you fundraise just a little bit more a year, that you would be penalized for that, because that goes completely counter to what we can do in service of community, of folks. And so I just want for just like as something just to lift up, is that we should not be sitting in these spaces of scarcity. We should be advocating for more resources, to have reserve funds, to build capital funds, to be able to build spaces so that we can have a sense of permanence in wherever we're at, so we don't have to be worried about whether or not we can make payroll, whether or not we can stay in our space, whether or not we can exist. And so just like a collective advocating for within our own communities, within the folks who are pulling levers of power, the importance and the value of making sure that we can actually operate from a space of abundance and from health. I think it's really important just to lift that up.
Thank you so much, Ayesha, for that. I did want to just kind of, before we go into Q&A, I do want to encourage everyone to check out both of these reports, whether you're just curious or if it can be helpful for you in any advocacy work and such. But the numbers are there, and it really is important to show elected officials and funders, et cetera, here is all of this information. And then not only that, but the map I feel like has been really helpful. I've become so much more aware of all the different organizations across New York State that are operating and can be great for partnerships, collaborations, and just amplifying each other's voices, advocating for each other by listening and by hearing and getting to know one another. So that has been really helpful just from outside. Yeah.
I just wanted to say too, in regards to identifying locations across New York State, New York City, New York State, that also what I think is really important is that this map puts in conversation redlining, covenant laws, transportation, where are community centers, where are the schools. So it's really dynamic in that it's not just saying we know here in Buffalo, New York that there's an arts institution, but we also know that they don't have transportation. Or we also know that there's been a history here of resources being pulled out of that community. So I think that there's that other component too that makes this map really, really important and an essential tool.
Thank you for bringing that up. Yes, I mean, one thing Jeremy, were kind of talking about this earlier, but the accessibility and lack of accessibility across the state for not only like tourism efforts and such, but just navigating throughout New York State, getting from place to place. I know it was difficult to get from Southampton today to New York City, and it really shows that you can see on the map, this is the transportation that's available, the lines, and really helping to advocate for New York State tourism efforts. That's very important because we can't help each other if we can't get to each other. So just highlighting that, but I really encourage you all to check out the brown paper map report and directory. I do want to thank our panelists for being here today, traveling from near and far for this conversation. And really being leaders in this project as well. I do want to open it up now for about 15 minutes of Q&A. If anyone does have questions, feel free to raise your hand. Yeah.
I saw a question.
Thank you to the panelists so much. My name's Evan, everyone. I'm from Syracuse. I'm one of the peoples out here in the crowd with my fellow collective members. I love this conference, so thank all of the people who made this happen. I'm learning so much about keywords like erasure, education, the connectivity between arts and education, and also just like how are we getting the information out? And to us as educators in this ecosystem that's happening right now, like what would you say to us and how we can get involved with your organizations? And what do you see that's needed to help educate our communities, and how can we do that creatively?
I can share for us, we have one of the things, again, in writing on history is documentation, archiving. We do a lot of public programming. So just this last weekend, we had a convening symposium gathering to talk about the role of public art within the context of gentrification and displacement in communities, cultural erasure. And so for that, we see the forum as an important space for a coming together of different experiences and ideas and mining that from one another, sharing and exchanging that with one another. So just showing up in those spaces, I think, is very critical and important to understand and make more visible the network that we have with one another and how deeply resourced we are ourselves within each other. There were very beautiful, synergistic kind of connections and coming together, intergenerational connection and relationship building of folks who lived right down the street from one another, who lived across the country from one another, who are now convening with one another, building coalition with each other, just off of being in that same room on that same Zoom session to understand the connections between their own individual practices. So one of the things that I would offer is showing up in these spaces is so important because we have so much information to share with one another, and that's the only way that we can truly thrive, is if we make visible all that we're holding within and all that we're sharing within our hyperlocal communities. We're not siloed folks. So how do we come together to build those resources with one another and share that within our networks as well?
I was also going to shout out the HueArts map because when I first came out, I thought about how do you support these organizations, and of course tourism, tours, that's a whole business. But I'm also now, thanks to your question, thinking about schools. Could school groups come to all these different institutions in the region now that they finally, as mentioned, don't really have an excuse to say that they're not there, or they have to have the someone who doesn't really represent that community trying to tell those stories. So I think that's really important. I don't think that's replaceable.
I would also say civic engagement. And I'm thinking about that Brian Cunningham, one of your assemblymen here, when the governor was looking to take $140 million off the table and statewide $40 million, that, there's a gentleman here who was talking about for Black and brown community there being a $50 million carve out. And understanding that that's because disproportionately there are certain institutional things that have happened that means that the arc to success, there are things that we're working on and struggles that we have that we need, there needs to be a number attached to that. There needs to be a number attached to that. I know that it's wonderful to show up, butts and seats, but also there needs to be there needs to be codified things that are happening as well. So I think the civic engagement and really educating people to show up for those who are showing up for us in your local and your federal legislature is really important.
Any other questions? Sorry, thank you.
Thank you. I was just wondering specifically for Indigenous voices and communities, what are the spaces and steps that people can take to uplift those voices? Because I know there's such a minority in the country right now, and that's not fair. But what can allies do, and what spaces I know you can't speak for all Indigenous communities, but what would your community like? What spaces would allies be a part of, and what spaces should allies not take space in?
Well, because it is the Hamptons, one thing I always think about is how people have like a very generous heart or soul, whatever you want to describe it. They want to bend over backwards to alleviate issues that have happened historically, including genocide and colonization. So they go as far as they can, but they don't go to that point of returning the land. And for whatever reason, that's too far. Like, I know I decimated your people, but this is like $1 million lot. So that's one thing that is frustrating because so often, I think everyone here knows like the Hamptons is a summer resort. People, like the top 1%ers are there 4 weeks out of the year sometimes. And so we have all these vacant places that are within our ancestral homelands that are just being wasted. And I'm also a visual artist, so one of the concepts I want to do is well, one of the justifications for colonization is the fact that Europeans thought that we weren't industrializing the land, we weren't extracting the resources, and so they stole it and tried to improve it. And now in the 21st century, we see that problem with the people who are descendants of settlers and colonists, and we're just sitting there waiting for that moment for them to finally rip up the deeds, if there are any. Even if there are deeds, it's probably forced or forged or something like that.
I think my answer too is that I've moved away from the word allyship. It feels very empty. I'm looking for co-conspirators. I'm looking for you to leverage your power as a white woman or whatever. Everyone has certain privilege in certain spaces. And so when you're in those spaces, to speak those truths, to say, you know, I'm looking around the table here and we're talking about a black community, but I don't see anyone black here, right? And understand there's a multitude of blackness. You know how many times I've been asked to go, I'm like, I didn't grow up in that neighborhood. There are other black people in the community. You need to be in service to their voices. So I think leveraging as a co-conspirator is really, really, really powerful.
Love
that. And one other thing that I would say as well is I think so often as artists that we go sit on the boards of other arts institutions. I have found that sitting on boards of those people who are looking at housing development and community development, education is also beneficial because there aren't very frequently our voices there. And we know intrinsically that art is an integral part of community, but if there isn't anyone there to intervene, to interject, then our voices aren't represented in that space.
Hi, my name is Katrina. Hi, Jeremy. I've been to Ma's house several times. And first of all, I just want to acknowledge the work, the effort, the lifeblood that you all have put into your work in the community to represent BIPOC and just have our voices be heard. And I think to your point of serving on boards, I am actually, there's a art space on the 3rd floor here called Urban Glass. And I am on the DEI committee of Urban Glass, and I had to email them and say, hey, there's something happening down here that you need to be a part of. You know, I just went upstairs and said, you know, we have a new education director, and I said, hey, there's something going on downstairs that you guys, why isn't Urban Glass being represented? Why aren't you part of this? Why don't you know about Arts and Education Roundtable? This is integral. This is so supremely important. And you say unless it's just performative, the DEI committee, and we're just flapping our lips and meeting and nothing happens, then get down here and participate and network and see how you can represent yourself in this neighborhood at all these events that occur. So I think the mapping is important because then they don't have the excuse to say, oh, well, we didn't know. We haven't seen any, you know, because they're not in our boardrooms. We're in theirs. So I just think for all of you, what she said was so important in terms of not allyship, but representation and just being cognizant that there's another way to represent, and that there's another way to be inclusive, and there's another way to diversify whatever situation you find yourself in. I've been in the arts all my life. I've very often been the only raisin in the pudding. So, you know, I understand this situation. And yes, you're allowed to use that phrase if you like to. So yeah, thank you from the depths of my heart. This is you know, this is a beautiful thing to see, that we're understanding that we need representation, that we have a voice, that we need to be included, that we need to be recognized, and that it needs to be something more than just performative and lip service.
And I'll add to that to bring the funders into the room too, for any organizations that are funded, to make sure that your funders know other organizations who are doing work like this that needs to be supported as well. It would be shocking to know that we are feeders of information to them, and from a space of abundance, there's enough money to support all of us over and over, many times over and over again. So again, it's boards, but it's also advocating to foundations, other organizations that are needing and deserving of their resources as well, and advocating for those other organizations also. I think it's a very important thing that oftentimes gets overlooked. It costs a lot of money to do. No, I hear you though. I totally hear you. Absolutely, absolutely.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, thank you for that question. Actually, our amazing communications manager is right behind you from MuseumHue, so Snap Surge. Right now, yes, that would be amazing. I would love to see that. It does cost a lot of money, which, funds are important, and we're working on that. But right now, we're working on marketing it out through our updated newsletters. So we have monthly newsletters. I encourage you to join MuseumHue's mailing list if you're not part of it yet, advocating for it through there to be shared out and on our social media platforms. Because yes, we are still working on securing more funding to, hopefully that would be wonderful to have it, have a QR code on the subway people could scan and learn more about it. But also sharing out with our partner orgs, folks on the map, just having those conversations, sending it over, sharing it in forums like this, through public programming initiatives and such, getting the word out there. So right now, that's how the HueArts New York State launched this past February. And then HueArts New York City, I've been on board with MuseumHue about 5.5 months, but I know New York City came out in 2020, I believe 2021, started in 2020. So they're relatively newer reports, but we're kind of amplifying them through social media programming right now, and then just partnerships, collaborations, getting the word out there. So please share it with folks if you think anyone would be interested. But yes, that end goal would be, having it plastered all over, and it's constantly being updated. So if you right now are sitting there, you go on the report and you're like, I don't see organizations on there that needs to be, please email us. We have it on our website, and we are always updating the map and directory as well. Any other questions? I know we have a few more minutes, maybe one more.
Thank you all for the discussion today. One of you mentioned, and I don't remember which one, funding for wrapping services. Can you please elaborate a little bit more on that?
It was actually something that came up. It was intense conversations that came up frequently with museum, with the HueArts report, is that frequently, because our institutions, BIPOC institutions, are situated within communities that have had systemic divestment, that means that we don't have a lot of the things that our other professional performing arts and culture institutions have. So that means when, as I said, when we're putting on a production, we realize that we're in a community that doesn't have proper transportation. So that means our budgetary line for the production would be this, but now we're also counting busing. And we also know that the children are now coming straight here, and they may not, particularly I'll say in Syracuse, New York, where we're dealing with with food deserts as well, is that the children aren't going to eat when they get home. So our budget now is going lower because we're also feeding those children. So there's just a lot of other kind of wraparound services that are happening on site that have to be accounted for in a budget that isn't just necessarily going to a dance or a performance as well. Yeah, we're talking about general operating support. And that's another thing that came up and was not a point of contention, but great concern, is that general ops is always very difficult to get, and that's where a lot of that wraparound money comes from. But there's also there's always the funding that goes into programming. And they also, one thing that came up that was a point of contention is that it's new programming. There's an emphasis on new programming. And for a lot of our organizations, again, situated in the community, that sustained programming is the core and really supports community, and to keep asking institutions to build without any kind of general ops really is stressful.
Can you give an unshameless plug of how we can find your organization? we are here in New York City, but we are upstate as well. We have Buffalo, Syracuse, we have all of these different places, but it seems like we're not as connected as we should be. I would like to know how we can find you, maybe get you all the way up to Syracuse or bring us back down to come to your organization so that we can, when we are mobilizing, trying to fight and get more money, we can be like, no, it's not just New York City fighting, it's all of New York State now. Unshameless fun, that's right.
Okay, an unshameless fun for the Black Artist Collective is that we are on Instagram. So if you put in Black Artist Collective, we will come up. It's BAC_CNY. We are also on Facebook as well, and we are working towards having the launch of our website relatively soon.
We are at laundromatproject.org. It's very simply our name. There you'll find resources, like I mentioned, to the over 200 artists that we've supported who are all mini ecosystems in and of themselves, doing incredible work around the city and around the country and around the world. And you can also have access to a lot of this archival material. We document everything. We share publicly everything to our strategic plan is public. If you'd like to go on and see how a strategic plan is drafted and executed, it is on our website. Our accountability report is on our website. We have reading resources on our website. It is an archive of information on there, as well as access to our programming. You can find everything on our website.
Yay! Oh, yay! Hey, how are you?
Oh, sure. We also have a website. It's www.mazhouse.studio. We're also mostly on Instagram at Mazhouse Studio. But to visit, I know we're probably maybe one of the further institutions, but you could take the Atlantic Terminal on the LIRR to Southampton, and I'll pick you up.
And there's the powwow.
Oh, yeah. September 1st to the 4th, thank you.
Shinnecock powwow.
Yeah. I don't know if you're saying mom or mom. Oh, M-A apostrophe, yes, sorry.
And I know we are at time. You can find MuseumHue at MuseumHue on Instagram and MuseumHue.com, where we have the Brown Paper Report map directory and plenty of other resources and upcoming programming if you are interested. But thank you all. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you for having us today. Thank you for the Arts and Education Roundtable. It's been wonderful to learn today.
Thank you. Please give it up for our incredible panel. Thank you so much. Panelists, I will say we're going to try to coordinate a photo with you. So our photographer, Amanda, who I'm sure you've seen roaming around, will be over in a minute. So before I turn it over for our final remarks, just two quick things that I want to share. Number one, I am so excited about the statewide advocacy question that was just asked. It is definitely something that's on the Roundtable's radar. Although we are the New York City Arts and Education Roundtable, we are constantly looking at ways that we know what's happening in broader New York State impacts the city and vice versa. So we're connecting a lot with the New York State Alliance for Arts Education, also New York or Arts NYS as well, and want to just learn more about you and your organizations if you're not from within the 5 boroughs, and also if you're in for the 5 boroughs as well. We want to know. Next, I also just want to send my regrets from Crystal Hudson. Crystal's not able to make it because they're currently negotiating our city budget right now, and the meeting is going a little long. So we're grateful that Councilmember Hudson is in that room, and she is negotiating. I know she is a huge supporter of arts and culture and of arts education, so we send her sort of strength and good vibes as she goes through that negotiation process. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the Day of Learning Subcommittee co-chair, Luglu Fogarty, just to say a few final remarks before we embark on a social hour for anybody that would like some free island pops, Brooklyn. So Lulu, take it away.
Hi, everyone. This type A gal did not prepare remarks before getting here today because I wanted to be here with you and see what the day would bring. And thinking that I would be speaking after Councilmember Hudson, who represents my district, I was psyched to, highlight that for better or worse, art is political. And education is political. And every single day that goes by, this is being driven into us, kicking and screaming more and more. So if you came here today to this event that was kicked off by the New York City Arts and Education Roundtable's Task Force for Equity and Inclusion, you are here because you are committed to justice. And thank you for joining us. Thank you to Toya Lillard and Stephen McIntosh for fearlessly leading our Task Force for Equity and Inclusion. Yes, if you are another member on that committee task force, please raise your hand, and can we give everyone a big round of applause? Thank you. Yes, absolutely. And a subcommittee of the task force is our Day of Learning planning subcommittee. So thank you again to my co-chair, Stephen McIntosh. And can everyone who is a part of that subcommittee please raise your hand, and can we please give it up for those folks? Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you to all of our presenters today. May you please raise your hands if you are still here with us. Yes. And I do want to just highlight, so here in the front row is my colleague Lakshmi, who I look up to in so many ways for always speaking out for disability justice. There's so much quantifiable information that is out there, and thank you to those of you archiving, sharing that data, giving us numbers that we can point to. And something that Lakshmi mentioned to me the other day is, how do we quantify the art experiences that are not happening? Because people cannot access institutions, cannot access these places where art is being created and celebrated, cannot access because of disability, because of wealth or lack of it. I mean, fill in the blanks. What are the things that are our barriers here? Institutional racism. What else? I mean, ableism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia. I spoke over someone over here. Abilities, fat phobia, yes. Money, okay? We do have some funders in the house, or at least they were here, so thank you to our funders who came out and showed support and know that it's important to be here. But I charge you all with sending that thank you email to someone who said something here today that meant something to you. Send that email, send that text, send that DM to that person who you're like, ooh, maybe we could partner on something. Because as so many people have said today, we can be living in abundance without competition with each other. We can be sharing these experiences, and it'll be better for all of us if we have these mutually beneficial partnerships across the field, because this is how, you know, Council Member Hudson, Mayor Adams, fill in the blank, are going to hear from us and actually take us seriously as we do work that is life-affirming and I truly believe life-saving. So thank you all for everything that you've done to be here today, from Stress-A-Ride to finding that childcare, and if there are people that you know that couldn't come today because of any barrier that exists, because there are countless, let us know. Let us know what we're doing well. Let us know what we're not doing well. I'm sure that there will be a survey that we would love for you to fill out so that we know how we can rise to the occasion together and continue to serve all of you in the ways that you serve your participants, your students, your families, your friends. Fill in the blanks. Join us at City Hall tomorrow morning. There might be some more, there's lots of information about that in the lobby. And join us for ice pops. I will take hugs. And thank you all so much for being here with us and my rambling.